Hi, welcome to this Blender video tutorial entitled Blender Materials Transparency. The Blender Materials editor contains a number of controls for adjusting the transparency of an object. To demonstrate the transparency controls, I have placed a smooth UV sphere into my Blender scene along with a ground plane. The UV sphere has a medium blue material linked to it, and the ground plane has a black and white check texture linked to it. I'm using the default camera and the default lamp, but I've added a second hemi-lamp at a very low energy level to fill in some of the shadows. I've also split my 3D viewport so that the rendering will appear in the right window. Blender has two separate and independent means of creating transparent materials. One employs a Z transparency control, and the other employs a ray tracing control. Both are located in the Transparency panel in the Materials Editor Properties panel. The two controls are mutually exclusive. Selecting the Ray Trace disables Z Transparency, and vice versa. The Z Transparency is based on a calculation derived from a Z buffer, which informs the rendering engine which of the object's faces are in front of other faces based on the position of the camera's viewing plane. Thus, in the case of our sphere, the Z buffer informs the render engine which of the sphere's faces are in front and which are in back. To use the Z transparency to create a transparent material, we need to first checkmark the transparency checkbox, select the Z transparency button, and then decrease the alpha slider. As we decrease the alpha level, the object becomes more and more transparent. You can see the result in the preview panel. Here I will reduce the Z transparency alpha to about 0.2 and render the scene. Note that the object becomes transparent. It is also possible to adjust the specular transparency by lowering the specular slider. Here I will set the specular alpha to 0.2 as well and render the scene. Z transparency is a quick, lightweight method of achieving transparent effects. However, what it does not do is provide any type of refraction effect, which is generally what happens in real-life situations. As we look through a transparent object like a wine glass, the light is bent and objects seen through the glass appear somewhat distorted. For transparent effects needing refraction, we need to use the Ray Trace control. Here I will select Ray Trace Transparency. I'll turn the alpha down to 0 and return the specular slider to 1. I will then increase the Ray Trace IOR, or Index of Refraction, to 1.02. Note that a very little refraction goes a long way. You can see in the preview window the distortion behind the transparent sphere. I'll render the scene. I'll replace the sphere with a smooth monkey object that I have on layer 2. I'll checkmark the transparency box, select Ray Trace, set the alpha slider to 0, and set the IOR to 1.02, creating the same settings that were applied to the sphere object. I'll now re-render the scene. Note that parts of the monkey are not transparent. This is because the default depth setting for Ray Trace Transparency is set to 2. This means that only 2 successive faces of the same object will be transparent. The monkey object is a bit more complex than the sphere, and from this particular vantage point, there are more than 2 overlapping faces, so the depth needs to be increased. I'll set the depth to 4 and re-render. The monkey object is now transparent. It is important to set the depth setting when using Ray Trace Transparency so that all of the overlapping faces are transparent. Now the filter setting adds an interesting control to transparency. Raising the filter setting adds back into the transparent material a certain amount of the diffuse color. Here I will set the filter setting to 0.6 and render. Notice that some of the diffuse color has been added to the material, even though the alpha is set to 0. giving the monkey a colored glass appearance. The gloss amount control further distorts or clarifies the underlying refraction distortion. Here I will set the gloss amount to 0.8. You can see in the preview sample the further distortion of the refracted background. I will render the scene. The result is a more smoky or pebbled colored glass effect. As it is with understanding Blender's shaders, it takes some time and practice to understand the variation in the effect provided by Blender's material transparency controls. Now, the best way to learn how to effectively use the transparency controllers is to experiment on your own and see how others have used them to create various materials. One of the best resources for this is the Blender Open Material Repository. This repository contains hundreds of materials that will provide an excellent jumping-off point for learning how to use Blender's transparency controllers. A link to the Blender Material Repository and other Blender material examples are located on our course site.